At the outset, it seems appropriate that you should know that I am neither a Muslim nor an Islamic scholar. Like Dr. Moore and Johnson, I work in the field, this is my area of research, in embryology, and it is a science that is concerned with all the changes that occur with the embryo, that is before birth, from the time of conception, that leads to the formation of a new individual. Rihal, one of the organizers of this evening's presentation, has brought to my attention that we have an audience from varying backgrounds, scientists and non-scientists, people with a wide range of interests. I've tried my best to organize what I will present to you with the great hope that there will be something for everyone. And if there are any questions or ambiguities, then my colleagues and I will try to answer these at the end. Religion and science do have some common goals, one being the pursuit of truth and the search for enlightenment. Fundamental to science and religion and philosophy is the question, the universal and timeless question regarding the nature of man. Indeed, we find just such a question in the Holy Qur'an. And if I may have the next slide, this first slide was so appropriate for the prayer. In fact, I brought it because it's a slide I always use for focusing the other slides. And it's such a pretty thing to look at this time of the year. Here we have a verse, a surah, which states, "From what substance had he created him?" And this is the timeless question of not only science or all philosophical discussions, but also of all religions. And in fact, this is what embryology is all about. As much as embryology deals with the genesis of all life forms, its history is inextricably related to the historical development of both scientific and philosophical thought. There are three phases if we look at the history of embryology, because we have to go into this a little bit in view of the fact of what I'll be telling you later with respect to the Qur'an. If we look at the history from time of antiquity up to the turn of the period with the beginning of our way of counting the years, we find that it was one where speculation predominated. And then came a descriptive phase where people observed things that were happening with chicken embryos or animal embryos, and they were describing those. And not until the 18th or 19th century, a new phase began where people began to play, to manipulate the embryo. They began to experiment with the embryo to understand how it develops. And that is what one would call an experimental phase. And more recently, there have been some very revolutionary approaches, the ultra-modern approaches, involving techniques we wouldn't need to talk about, that add a new dimension to our understanding of what happens with the embryo or fetus in utero, in the womb. As marvelous and awesome the discovery relating to human development before birth this century might be, there is so much that has already been recorded in the Holy Qur'an, some 1400 years ago. That is, long before any instrument or object, a tool, a microscope, or a lens might have been discovered to look at a structure in order to magnify it. Now, I have to pause here for a moment because I will ask your understanding. It's something that it took even a person like myself to grasp, and that is for you to relate to the time period we are talking about. If you go back 1400 years ago, or even 1800 years ago, we are in a different time frame, in a very entirely different environment, where perhaps they were thinkers, but no scientists in the sense that we know them, in the sense of people with white lab coats working in a laboratory doing experiments. They were simple people looking at things, making observations and describing these observations. They were scientists too, but they were of a different kind. And when they saw something that was unusual or something worth noting, they recorded these things too. And they were recorded with an equal simplicity. And this is what is the first point I want to draw your attention to, is the fact that if we were trying this evening, or we would try this evening, or you would be trying on your own, to relate the modern discoveries of scientists pertaining to the embryo, and as recorded in the great journals and scientific literature you find in the libraries today, to what has been recorded 1,000 years ago, then that would be difficult, because you're dealing with two entirely different environments, two different sets of people, different values, different criteria, different ways of observing things. But profound is the elegant simplicity. The elegant simplicity we find mentioned in the Qur'an, some remarkable statements on human prenatal development. And if I may have the next slide, please. From what substance had he created man? This, as I said, is one of the fundamental questions of religion and science. And a good starting point is perhaps with this gentleman you have here on the screen, Aristotle, who is known for a great many things, but he was the most celebrated thinker, philosopher, scientist of antiquity. He lived in the 4th century BC, 400 years, approximately 322 to 382 to 324 BC. And he seems to be a very appropriate starting point, because with him we could sort of grasp the kind of thinking that went on before, and we could see what the level of understanding of the embryo was at that time, about 400 years BC. Now Aristotle wrote in his book, which translated in English means the generation of animals, meaning the reproduction of animals, and a book he considered to be his masterpiece. In fact, both Charles Darwin, who many of you would know of, and a very famous scientist, Isaac Newton, they thought that Aristotle was the greatest scientist that ever lived. Aristotle, in his book, which he himself considered to be a masterpiece, wrote that the embryo evolved from the egg, and the egg comes from the female. Even though the psyche, that is the principle of life, was derived from the male, but how he did not know. And the womb merely serves as an incubator for the formless mixture of menstrual flow and semen. For centuries after Aristotle, the thought was that the womb was an incubator, and the menstrual flow somehow coagulated with the semen. And essentially what happens is that the embryo is formed, or the potential for the embryo to be formed exists once a month, not because of an egg, but because of the menstrual flow. This was the concept for centuries. And even, if we may have the next slide, please, after the discovery made by this gentleman, who lived in the 17th, the latter part of the 17th, and the early part of the 18th century. And this is a gentleman, a Dutchman, by the name of Leeuwenhoek, some of you would have heard of the name, who found a way of taking a piece of glass, and grinding it, putting it together, making a microscope, how simple it might have been, to make things look bigger. This was not discovered until about 200 to 300 years ago. And when this discovery was made, then one was in a position to look at an egg that might have come from a dog, or to look at an embryo that might have been developing like a chick embryo. But it did not add anything new as far as our understanding until much later with respect to the contribution, the relative contribution of the male and the female towards the formation of a new individual. To make my point very clear to you, I will show you on the next slide what one saw in the 17th century in the head of sperm. It just shows the extent of one's imagination. And there are, in the libraries of the world, you'll find many volumes, books with hundreds of pages of drawings showing you a little man, a little dog, a little rabbit, a little girl sitting in the head of a sperm. And that was supposed to be, some of you would know, the so-called homunculus, which over a period of 9 months or so in the womb would unfold and become a new individual. So the theory was now changing and shifting from the menstrual flow, the female egg, to now solely the male. And again, the uterus or womb was like an incubator. And this was 200-300 years ago. If we may have the next slide, please. But here we have a statement which I find most remarkable personally. Because here is a statement coming from a much earlier period. In the Holy Qur'an, we find in this surah, 39, the remarkable statement, He makes you in the wombs of your mothers in stages, one after another, in 3 veils of darkness. It's a surah I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's a very simple statement. But then reflect back again what I've said at the very beginning. The time period we are thinking of, it's not in the 20th century. A lot of us looking at this statement in the 20th century would look at it and say, it's a very trivial, frivolous statement. It's true, so what's the big deal? But if you go back in time and think, it's a profound statement with very important facts. It says, He makes you in the womb, in the uterus of your mothers, in stages. It's not something that is formed completed, as I showed you earlier, that will unfold itself. It's a progressive thing. One after the other, there is a stage that is formed, and it leads to another stage, and there's another stage, and then there are 3 veils of darkness which surround these different stages as these stages unfold. And if we may have the next slide, please. And here is a photograph I have. I've drawn very heavily from the works of my colleagues, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Moore, particularly Dr. Moore, because on previous occasions they have talked on these topics, and I felt that why should I reinvent the wheel? And I've gone back to their work and referred to it. And in fact, this slide you're seeing here is one that is taken from Dr. Moore's paper that he presented, I believe, to this group on a previous occasion. And it shows here the embryo, or fetus as it is now, in the womb, and 3 veils of darkness as Dr. Moore at that time conceived it, and is willing to change his mind because of discussions we have had with Islamic scholars over the years. And there are all sort of variations to this, but the important thing is, if you look, you will see here the wall of the abdomen, of the belly, the wall of the uterus, and here what is known as the amnion and chorion for those who are in the audience. Some may say if you dismiss the wall of the abdomen, you could have the wall of the uterus, you could have the amnion, the chorion, and what is known as the decidua. These would be things that do exist, that we could not have known of their existence. The most if anyone could have conceived of, well, sure, it is in the uterus, and outside of the uterus we have the abdominal wall. The third would have still been difficult to have known about, but here we have recorded these 3 veils of darkness. surrounding the embryo as it is unfolding its stages in its development. Next slide, please. Now, if we go back in history, and as one of my hobbies, I'm interested in the history, like many of you, of medicine, and this is one of the things that got me involved in what I'm doing here this evening, because of the attraction of bridging the two things, the science, history, and religion. We find that there are many drawings depicting the womb, but none with a fetus in it, or an embryo. This is the first you're seeing. The first known drawing that was made in the 14th century by the famous, celebrated Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was probably one of the greatest of geniuses to have lived, a man accomplished in so many areas. And here we have a drawing of the womb in which he depicted a child sitting in it. And this is the first we know in the 14th century. That's almost 1,000 years after. I'm not saying that there might not have been the concept or the view that the uterus could contain a child or a fetus, but here is the first depiction of that. Next slide, please. But here is a surah, one again, very powerful, very profound, in fact the whole of embryology here, and one of great but elegant simplicity. We, God, created man from a quintessence of clay. We then placed him as a nutfa, drop, in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Each statement here is profound. The nutfa, place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we made the drop into an alaqah, a leech-like structure. And then we changed the alaqah into a mudghah, chewed-like substance. Then we made out of that mudghah bones, itham. And then we clothed the bones with flesh, laham. Then we caused him to grow and come into being and attain the definitive form. So blessed be God, the best to create. Here we see not only a description of the stages, but names given to the stages. Names given to the stages that accurately characterize the features of those stages as we know them today. And these were descriptions and names that have been put together 1400 years ago. Could I have the next slide, please? Now the nutfa. What is the nutfa? There are many concepts of this. The word may have two meanings, as Dr. Johnson wrote in one of his papers. It could be a drop, and the second is a small amount of water. And many interpreters of the Qur'an have referred to this meaning of the word. As stated in the Qur'an, we then placed him as a nutfa in a place of settlement. You must bear in mind that when this was mentioned in the Qur'an, at that time, scientists, if they can be called scientists, or thinkers and philosophers, believed that the human being was created from menstrual blood. The place where the nutfa rests in the uterus has been described in the Quran as garar, a place of settlement. In recent years, science has discovered many facts regarding the collective description of how the uterus expands to accommodate the fetus and provides it with a suitable place of settlement. According to many interpreters, the word makin means firmly fixed and refers to the relationship of the uterus to the body of the mother. Its firm positioning in the body is described in the Quran, and thus the relationship between the fetus and uterus and between the uterus and the body of the mother are so beautifully encompassed by the meaning of the two words qarar and makin. So if we may have the next slide, please. And this is what we would understand as a nutfa, after the egg has been fertilized, it forms what is known as a zygote, and the zygote then changes and becomes a structure that has many more cells, and these things are given different names. But this would be our interpretation of a nutfa, and a place of settlement would be in the walls of the uterus, firmly fixed, the uterus firmly fixed in the mother. Next slide, please. And here we see a statement, even then, that makes it quite clear. It's not the male, it's not the female, it's not menstrual blood. Verily, we created man from mixtures of germinal drops. Next slide, please. And that he did create the two sexes even, the male and female, from that drop, that zygote, as it is emitted or planned. And this planning, we could spend the whole evening talking about planning. It could encompass everything of the child, of the new individual, with respect to genetic programming, and that is there that will determine the characteristics of the child. Next slide, please. And this is a summary to show you again, just a simple drawing, a sketch to show you the egg being fertilized here, and the fertilized egg traveling. This would be the nutfa. It travels along here until it reaches the wall of the uterus, when it attaches itself, a firm place of settlement, and then we have the other stages that will then progress. Next slide, please. And here we come to this then out from a sperm drop, and you notice here is a different interpretation of the word nutfa here, a sperm drop. This is a literal translation. I would like to put then out from a zygote, nutfa, then from a leech-like clot, aracha, the next stage, which is like a leech, then from a tube-like structure, mudka, and could we have the next slide, please? And this is what an embryo looks like immediately after that stage. After the nutfa stage, we go into the alaka stage, and this is what a leech looks like. It's a drawing again from Dr. Moore's work. And here is what an embryo would look like at that stage. The similarity in features. Now this happens towards the end of the third week. Very, very early and very small for you to see, for one to be able to see anything with the naked eye, and even with a simple lens. And during the fourth week, we'll move on, please. Next slide. Well, this is again a slide to show you here the transfer from the alaka into the mudga. The tube substructures here, you can see some of them here. These are things that are called somites. They are present here. This is what it looks like at the end, by the end of the fourth week. Next slide, please. And this is a special technique, a scanning electron micrograph of an embryo at the end of the fourth week. You could see here those chewed-like impression, as if you took a piece of meat and you were chewing in it, and this would leave the kind of impression here. This is very, very characteristic. And this is the end. This is the head of the embryo. All of this will form its face. That's the heart. And this is what a human embryo, this is not a rat, this is a human embryo, looks at the end of the first month. And the word mudga means something that has been chewed by the teeth. The small matters, a piece of meat, the size that can be chewed. By days 26 to 28 in development, the embryo appearance changes to that of a chewed substance. Now the somites, the ones I showed you here, are very characteristic of that stage. The short time involved with the change from alaka to mudga is also indicated in the Qur'an by the use of the conjunctive fa, meaning then. And as all of you probably know, better than I do, the word fa indicates a sequential order. One thing leading into another without a long delay. It's happening very quickly, and so it is in the human. Thus far, modern embryological observations apply completely with these descriptions of the stages of embryonic development as listed and as presented in the Qur'an. Next slide, please. Now this is very interesting. This is a piece of plasticine, I think, a piece of gum or so. Dr. Moore took it, put it in his mouth and chewed on it just to see what it would look like. And you could see it does give the appearance of chewed substance. Am I right, Keith? Yes. And this is a very, it's remarkable when you compare these two things with the embryos I showed you earlier. The similarity in structure is evident here with regards to these things I've described the somites. Next slide, please. And now, from mudga, then we made up of that mudga bone. Now, this sequence is very important. Idham. Then we clothe the bones with flesh, lacham, muscle. And then we get to the next stage. But here are distinct stages described. And again, I ask you to go back to the time frame because I am so much impressed by it that I have to keep on reminding you not only the time period, but the simplicity of life at that time in describing things, how it would be described. It wouldn't be in great protocols and great prestigious journals. These would be simple statements of facts, observations made, because these are observations that were made or that were revealed, that were put together for what they were worth. Then we made the drop into an alakha, we have seen that, into a mudga, and then we have got the idam and lacham here. These are all distinct stages, progressing from something that is very simple, a drop, to something that is becoming more complex. And we see a sequence of events. And these words then and then in the Quran, when you look at the translation and then, they're either fa or tuma. One meaning happening very quickly, as you know, and the other meaning happening with delay. And the sequencing of these two are exactly as we know them today. Could we have the next slide, please? And here is a human embryo that is just at the end of 6th week going into the 7th week, where we begin to see changes. This is a human occurring in the bones. The special technique of making the embryo or fetus transparent, and then a special staining technique is applied so that we can then see the bones or what will become bones. These things, as some of you know, will start as cartilages, and out of the cartilages bones will be formed. For example, here are the jaws, nicely shown. Here is the bone, the collarbone here, and here we have bones of the arm, here on the skull. But the important point is we have the beginning of the stage we talked about earlier, idham, happening, and shortly thereafter other things begin to happen. Next slide, please. Here. All of this happening within a matter of a week or two, until we have now a fetus which is about 12 weeks old, 12 weeks, 3 months old, and here you could see a fair amount of this skeletal system of the bones which have appeared. Next slide, please. But concurrently with those changes, you can't see them because that fetus has been made transparent. They are the changes associated with the clothing of that idham with flesh, lacham. And here we see, and clothe the bones with flesh. We can stop there and move on to the next slide, please. Because here is a fetus. In fact, it's a stage of an embryo going to a fetus where bones are already present. We have a very simple hand being formed. It will, over the next few months, it will become more complicated to become the real things we have. And here we have the leg. We have a very simple head here, features of the face, some characteristics that resemble human but not exactly human. But the sequence, the point I wish to make here is this. The sequential ordering of the events in fetal development, and the close timing between the fourth and fifth stages which I've described of idham and laham respectively, as described to in the Qur'an, are in full agreement with contemporary embryological observations. And could we move on please to the next slide? Now that's a very interesting statement again, a hadith. When 42 nights have passed over the conceptus, God sends an angel to it who shapes it. Now that's approximately, as you would recall, as you know, it's after the 6th week, and in fact 6 weeks would be what I've shown you just a little bit earlier, those 3 embryos. God sends an angel to it who shapes it into human form and makes it ears, eyes, skin, muscles and bones, and I wouldn't go into the rest. But the point I'm trying to make here, we're talking about human development as conceived and documented a very long time ago. And the next slide please. Because before the 42 weeks, as we know it, this is what the face of an embryo would look like. These are the different parts that will have to come together to make our nose, our face, our forehead, as we would like to have it as attractive as it could be. And the next slide, please. And this is what the arms look like. All of this before the 42 days. And the next slide, please. But now comes the dramatic changes. Because just a week later, after that 42 days, just about 10 days later, all those structures become transformed slowly and are beginning to look like something that is human. With human characteristics, at least human external characteristics. Could I have the next slide, please? And here we have a fetus which is now during its 12th week of development. We see here the skin, well-developed muscles, bones, in fact, all recognizable features of the new individual are here. In fact, they are here long before this period. Next slide, please. We have well-defined fingers with nails being formed, as you can see. Next slide. And here the toes, which you didn't have. In fact, you had something, a flat paddle before that period. Next slide, please. Now the external genitalia, the external sex organs, if you want to look at it. There is a lot in the Qur'an about sexual development. Time will not allow us to go into that. But let me finish that hadith for you. Then he says, O Lord, is it male or female? And your Lord decides what he wishes, and the angel records it. The point I wish to make is this. By the 4th week of development, the sex of that individual, the anlaga we call it, the anlaga, the early features are already there but not evident. No one could recognize them. By 9th week, as you can see here, they are distinguishing features. And only during the 12th week can you differentiate between the male and the female. So the timing of all of this is correct as given here. Next slide, please. That's the male, this would be the female here. Only at the 12th week would you be able to distinguish these two things. Next slide, please. And now comes a very interesting phase, and that is what I would like to describe as the final phase, the Nasha phase. The rapid growth and developmental changes of the fetal period, which occur after the bones have been clothed by the muscles, I've already mentioned to you. And we clothe the bones with muscle, does Surah 23 say. Then we cause him to grow. and attain and come into being and attain the definitive human form. The Qur'an uses the word anashanahu regarding the attainment of human form, which in fact corresponds to the fetal period. Next slide, please. And it is these dramatic changes which all of us are familiar with, occurring after that period, that we see this Nasha period, this Nasha Nahu period, that leads to the development of, or to the manifestation of a full-fledged newborn infant. Next slide, please. Which you have here. And so we see that 1400 years ago, from the very few verses, not to take more time because my colleagues will have to speak and we have a discussion to go on, we have terms that have been recorded that are descriptive of stages that have been identified very clearly, showing the sequence of events from the nutfah stage, and not just the nutfah stage, but what will happen to that nutfah within the womb itself, through changes of alaqa, mudghah, idham, until we get to the final phase of nasha, as we can see here. And with that, I would like to stop now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to speak to you again. I spoke to this group, I think it was 2 years ago, and when Raheel asked me if I would speak again, I said, well, really, they've heard everything I have to say, and why not invite my colleagues to come and speak about this, and I could comment after. So that's how this evening's program was arranged. A little history of how we got involved, because no matter where we have gone to talk about this, people say, well, how did you get involved in this work? Well, first of all, I was invited to Saudi Arabia to lecture in embryology at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And I went there and I gave my lectures, and while I was there, I, at my suggestion, invited Dr. Persaud and Dr. Johnson to come to Saudi Arabia, and they asked them the same questions, and I purposely didn't tell them my interpretations. I wanted them to give their own. So they did, and their answers were similar to mine. Not only that, and I should say that Dr. Johnson is one of the most outstanding embryologists and teratologists in the United States. We didn't just pick anyone, I picked the best. And in Canada, Dr. Persaud at University of Manitoba, where I spent 20 years, is also an outstanding embryologist who has 3 doctor's degrees, plus membership in pathology. So I picked the very best. And then when I started thinking about other embryologists around the world, we brought in Dr. Edwards from Cambridge, who is some of you remember the early work on in vitro fertilization, where they fertilize the ovum outside the mother because the sperm and the egg can't unite because of a blockage in the uterine tube or fallopian tube, and so they have to fertilize it outside the body and then they put it in. That's called in vitro fertilization. Now, Dr. Steptoe was an obstetrician, and Dr. Edwards was the embryologist and physiologist who were first successful in fertilizing an ovum outside the uterus or outside the tube, and then putting it into the uterus and having it develop into a baby. And that baby is Louise Brown, who I guess is 12 years old or something now. That is a whole story. But Dr. Edwards is world-renowned for his early work in this area. So we invited him to Saudi Arabia, and again, he was asked the same questions, and they got essentially the same answers. We also have one of my colleagues from Kyoto in Japan, and although he didn't go to Saudi Arabia, he has been consulted and so on. So we have consulted embryologists around the world for their opinions on these statements in the Qur'an. And it's clear from what Dr. Persaud has said, and from all of our work in this area, that these statements are correct. The stages, we didn't know about stages, as Dr. Persaud says, until a few years ago. Now we use the stages. We call it stage 1, stage 2. But working with these scholars in Saudi Arabia, we have developed a system of classification which we expect will be used by Muslim medical and other students, health students around the world, because it's a system which follows along with their Quran. In fact, the scholars in Saudi Arabia, along with Dr. Persaud, Dr. Johnson, myself, and others, have translated my book. I have a book in embryology, and they took this and they produced a copy of my book with what they call Islamic additions. So each chapter they put in 3 or 4 pages citing the verses from the Quran, just as you see here, and then the interpretations that they've obtained from me and others in this book. Now this book is not available for sale as such. You can't go in a bookstore and buy it, but Raheel knows where you can get it. Or I should say Sheikh, his name, Mustafa Ahmad in Chicago, and Raheel has his name and so on, and the copies of this book are available to Muslim societies. I have one copy, and anyone wants to borrow it, you can certainly do that. I've loaned that to some of the students who've written essays on this and so on. So we have been involved, and we're still involved. And just before I finish, I just show this one slide because we've been carrying on with our studies with the people at King Abdulaziz University. And one of the things that we were in, not embryology really, because we are anatomists, which are anatomists study the structure and function of the human body, also the structure of the brain, and embryology, which is developmental anatomy, and also histology, the study of tissues and so on. So anatomists cover these various areas. So again, they asked me about some statements in the Qur'an about the brain. And as this slide shows, the brain, and for years it's been known, not back in those early days, but recently, when people were able to touch various parts of the brain, they were able to obtain movement. So if you touched it here in the motor area, you'd get movements of the limbs and so on. If you touched it various other places, you get sensation of taste and so on. And here's the visual area here. You touch that, and they would get visions, hallucinations, and so on. So these parts of the brain were known to be active. But this part here, which is in your forehead, is the frontal area, and when they touched that, nothing happened. So they considered this was a silent area of the brain. In fact, for many years, they didn't know what this part of the brain did. So these had little to do with the control of the functions of the body. Now, the frontal lobes, here in the last 50 years, we've learned that these frontal lobes are concerned with some of the highest mental functions of animals and humans. And we've done various studies which show that they are concerned with these highest levels of our thinking. And when memory of recent events suffers, when you cut the nerve fibers going to this part of your brain, then there is a loss of memory, and the patient has an inability to solve problems, and they're more or less what we would call a vegetable. And a number of years ago, they used to do what we call frontal lobotomies. People who were very mentally ill, they would cut the fibers going to their brain because this stopped them thinking and being concerned about life, and so they didn't worry. So the Qur'an has described the relationship between the frontal lobes of the brain and the ethical behavior of human beings. And there is surah, and I don't have a slide of it, but it reads, "Do you see one who forbids a servant of ours, God, when he turns to pray? Do you see if he who prays follows the guidance and enjoins righteousness? Do you see if he who obstructs, rejects truth, and turns away? Does he not know that God sees? Let him beware. If he desists not, we, that is God, will punish him upon his forehead." A lying, sinful forehead. And the word used in the last two verses, which means the forehead. The forehead is, in this statement, we believe refers to the frontal lobes of the brain. And I was asked, how could the forehead have anything to do with sinning and with lying and so on? And I suggested that it was related to this higher function, so that the act of lying is initiated by the mental activities in the frontal lobes, and its instructions are then carried out by other parts of the brain, which affect the speech organs and the sexual organs and so on, so that they can bring about these unlawful acts and so on. So that we believe then that sins are planned in the frontal lobes before they're carried out by the eyes, the hands, and sexual organs. A hadith of the Prophet asserts that the forehead represents the center of direction and control, and that it's the front of the head. He said, "No distress and grief occurs to anyone who says, 'O Lord, I am your slave and the son of your slaves. My forehead is in your hands, firm in your ruling, and my destiny from you is just.'" This hadith indicates to us, and this is a paper that we presented at least in Pakistan last year. I wasn't able to go, but Dr. Persaud read this paper, and it'll be published soon, that it mentions that it explains that the forehead is in God's hand. Therefore, it indicates that the forehead plays a great part in the control and the direction of human behavior. And we believe that this is why it is recommended. God orders Muslims to perform sujud. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. That is, place your foreheads on the ground, as stated in the continuance of the Quranic verses. "Then let him call his associates. We will call on the angels of punishment. Then follow not him, but prostrate yourselves and draw nearer to us," that is God. This order to perform sujud means we should place the center of our will and decision-making processes on the ground to show absolute submission to God. A person who is punished in the forehead could have his frontal lobes damaged. This would interfere with his higher mental functions, which would reduce his mental ability and cause signs of complacency and self-satisfaction. Thus, this Qur'an has described the role of the forehead, or more specifically, the function of the frontal lobes of the brain in making decisions. And the hadith has been referred to the role of the forehead in the control and the direction of human behavior. So this is just another example of some of the work that we've been doing in helping the scholars at Mecca to interpret these verses. And as Dr. Persaud said, we don't read Arabic. The scholars translate it for us, and we simply give our interpretations. We're not saying that they're accurate, but they agree with what other embryologists around the world have said that they do. So we're trying to help interpret these. And there are other statements in the Qur'an that have been read to us and say, what does this mean? And obviously, talking about development, we say we don't know, we don't understand. That doesn't bother me, and it shouldn't bother you, because 300 years ago we didn't understand these verses. Today we understand some more of them, and maybe 100 years from now, when we make new discoveries, we will understand what some of those other verses mean. And it will be up to scientists and other scholars who follow us to make the appropriate interpretations. Thank you. I have them here, and I'll loan this to Raheel. They're all in this draft of the paper. I can do it when we get over to the table. I think it would take too much time for me to fumble through here, but I have them here if you want to come up and see it.
Good evening. I'm Marshall Johnson from Philadelphia. My background is similar to that of Drs. Persaud and Moore, but somewhat different also. I am not nearly the embryologist that either one of those two individuals is. My specialization is congenital malformations, that is birth defects, and most of my research is involved with grinding up very early embryos of various species and various kinds of developing systems to look at their biochemistry to try to figure out what is going wrong that causes abnormal development to take place. In order to do that, one must be somewhat familiar with at least experimental embryology. It's a real pleasure, and I thank the Muslim Students Association for inviting me here to join with these two gentlemen to try to shed a little bit of light here in the end of the 20th century on what some writings were over 1400 years ago. I first went to work on this topic some 5 or 6 years ago when I was invited to Saudi Arabia to join Drs. Moore and Persaud. I was not prepped ahead of time. I have known these two individuals for some time, but when I arrived there, Sheikh Abdul Majid Zindani was prepared, and he had about 2 days of questions for me. And I sat and did the best I could to answer each of these questions with no idea what their origin was. It was subsequent to this that I was provided with a translated version of the Qur'an so I could sit in the following years and have the opportunity to read it. One cannot help but be struck that many things were known which could not have been known 1400 years ago. Dr. Persaud, I think, just gave the best overview of this I have ever heard or read when he talked about the various stages. Those stages are rather precisely defined in the Qur'an, and in fact the Qur'an uses some stages or provides us with some stages which we've not been aware of before. When he speaks of the alaka and mudga stages, they are stages, and when one looks at it from hindsight, after having had these terms offered to you and the Quranic meaning provided for you, then as a morphologist one can come back and say, yes, that is a stage. We hadn't recognized it as such. We've never had a definitive term to describe it before, but certainly here is a stage. When one talks about the bones then being clothed with flesh, and the word then is in there so often, and the thens are always in the proper sequence. And these are things which weren't known until about 200 years ago, supposedly. The idea that we are created from mixtures, that at a particular time the external genitalia are recognizable as a binary, the two sexes. Those kinds of things are rather interesting to read from a book which was recorded by a simple man, the Prophet, peace be upon him, writing these things where he would have supposedly no laboratory with which to see them, and if he had the laboratory, the tools to see them with had not been invented yet. An interesting aspect of this is a concept presented and espoused by Sheikh Zindani, and that is that many of the things which we today can recognize here in the 20th century, we can recognize these stages. We could not have recognized them 200 years ago. if the embryologists that existed 200 years ago had been asked to identify these stages and to describe them, it would not have been possible for them to do it. These kinds of things weren't known that recently. But similarly, in the experimental realm, there are still things which we are just now discovering. It has been in certainly your lifetimes, but because it's just in my lifetime, that we have come to understand a bit of what is described in the Qur'an as the program and the planning ahead, that things were determined and then it was just a program that played out. That's just since Watson and Crick have come along that we have understood how that program works. Dr. Moore mentioned that there are things which we don't understand, and for the past 2 years I've been working with one, and that is the idea of created from clay. Well, that's something which we don't understand today, but there is just beginning to appear in the peer-reviewed scientific literature ways, theories, not hypotheses, but testable theories, to the extent that various kinds of clays and silicas can form as an organizational matrix, which is not dissimilar to that, from that, which we would consider as the DNA template to do the kinds of things for the assemblage of and differentiation of cells, that clays can do the same kinds of things to put molecules into an organized configuration, so that then one could go to the first stage up from that, and that is a semi-permeable membrane or a cell membrane. So Dr. Persaud spelled out the sequence of events which are listed in the Qur'an. What Sheikh Zandani is talking about is the fact that we are part of that timeline. We are also on a timeline wherein some things we think we're very wise because we can describe them today. We can describe these translations today. We couldn't have done it 200 years ago. There are other things which are written in the Qur'an which we just now are beginning to see, and others which we can't quite understand just yet. So for me, the kinds of things that Sheikh Zandani is working with us, and other scholars from the Islamic world are working, we're helping them, I guess, certainly, are the kinds of things which are certainly very intriguing. And to a scientist who is not a scholar in this area, doesn't even speak the language in which the book is written in, it's truly a remarkable kind of quest and a very exciting adventure that one wished one could live a few hundred years so you could see more of it as it's being played out. Thank you for being here tonight.
It's regarding the common thing which is heard, which is that the Quran is a man's speech, it's Muhammad's speech, and so on. And so the questioner is asking if your opinion as scientists, based on what you read of the Quran, what do you think about this allegation or about this statement? I suppose I'll just put it forward, and anyone who wishes to answer can.
Well, I think each one of us has said that when we were first read these verses in the Qur'an, we were amazed that these sort of statements were made so long ago, and yet they were so accurate. Now, we've traveled various countries, and when I met someone from Egypt, and you always have the critics, and one person said, this is not true, they just copied this from what was known. Well, we can assure you that it wasn't known in those days. Turned out, it showed how naive I was. I thought all Egyptians were Muslims, but they're not. And it turned out that this person that was arguing with me was one of the Coptic Christians who doesn't, of course, believe what is in the Qur'an. And I said, well, if you can show me anywhere in the scientific literature, the history of the science, where these things were known in the time that the Qur'an was recorded, you show it to us. And Dr. Persaud, as he said, is an interest in history. He's written books in the history of anatomy, the history of embryology, and we've never come across any of this. So this knowledge was available in those days. It's certainly not been recorded anywhere, and so, as we say, it just was not available. So I guess amazement was a thing that presented to each one of us. We just couldn't believe that these things were written, and yet they are accurate 1,400 years later. That was our reaction.
There's a question here which says, what about anachronistic speculation? Although the description of the Quran, which seems to be of a literary nature, to coincide with your research, it is evident that verses are dispersed, that these verses regarding embryology, I suppose, are dispersed throughout the Quran. So could we be reading anyway what is beyond, I guess, beyond what is intended in the Quran, or could these be allegorical or metaphorical?
Well, it always could be someone's position, I guess, and there's no way for a scientist to counter that if someone has made up their mind on that. One is dependent upon the translations. At least I certainly am dependent upon the translations, but I have no reason to doubt that the translations that are being provided are accurate. I've heard the same translations from scholars in a variety of countries on their own home turf. Well, they had no reason where they had to keep me happy. I'm just a scientist. I think a thing that strikes me, and there always will be people who well, we should disagree. That's how we make progress. We should never all agree with one another. But to me, the thing that puts those discussions to rest is that there is such diversity of where the definitions are coming from, and these people are very serious scholars of the language. But in addition is the fact that this is not just something that was written down and it's all over with now. To me, I'm an experimental embryologist, and to me, the story, my part of it is still being written. I mean, my understanding of it, the experimental embryologist part of this is an ongoing quest. We're still finding out things, some of which we've just found out recently. They're in there. There are a few things which we're just becoming to understand now. They're in there. There are some things which we don't yet understand, and it would be worthwhile to go back and pay more attention to what is written there, because, as Sheikh Zandani says, this can give us some good clues as to the kinds of investigations that we might want to take in the future. So I don't have any difficulty with that position being expressed. Thank you.
I think that's a very important question. And I would only like to make 2 or 3 comments. The first is that never once, I think any of us here, and I in particular, when presented with one of the surahs or hadith, have attempted to say whether this is correct or wrong, to prove that it is so. I think to do so would be very arrogant on our part. Very, very arrogant. What we have done is we have looked at these statements when they were first presented to us at their face value and examine them and think of them in terms of our limited knowledge of how things are as revealed by the progress of science. We have interpreted, we have examined, but never have we once tried to prove that they are right or wrong. That would, as I said, that would be the limits of arrogance. The second point is, and I think this is an extremely important, we give an impression as if, we meet with the Islamic scholars, or they meet with us, and this has happened on many occasions over the past few years, and it's as if it's an informal chat over a cup of coffee. But this has never been like that. In fact, it is the most grueling experience for anyone like ourselves. I go and meet, and it goes on for days and nights, until I don't think we ever get to sleep until the early hours of the morning. every hour is being used to dissect, analyze, to think, and it becomes for someone not accustomed to a bit of a frustrating experience. But I suppose this is how it is. Tiring, not frustrating, tiring experience. But the Islamic scholars, our scholars, they understand more about these things. They can interpret, they can read the Qur'an, the Hadiths, and their interpretation. And we only rely on that. And never to prove or refute, to say the Qur'an is correct, that would be, as I said again, and I must state this would be the limit of arrogance to try to do a thing like that. All we've been doing is examining and thinking about it. I mean, we're still doing that.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out also that that in respect to most of those verses which were put up there, those words, for example, like alaka and mulka and so on, they have a linguistic root. And these roots are descriptive in nature, and based on this, I believe that the doctors have built most of their conclusions are based on the fact that these words are descriptive in nature, and they describe certain features. As for example, we saw on the slides about the mudga, a chewed lump, and for example, we saw the somites. They appeared to have, as if they had teeth marks. So I just wanted to make a small point about that. Here's a question which I think also they get many times, which is that the questioner is asking, in relation to the abortion controversy, when does life begin, according to, I suppose, the Quran? And they just want you to elaborate. And I think it's addressed to Dr. Persaud, but I guess anybody who wants to.
That's a difficult question, isn't it?
Do you want me to have a go at it?
I remember several years ago, a friend of mine told me in Winnipeg, he says, life begins when the kids leave home. But well, isn't life a living thing? A cell is a living thing. I think Dr. Moore and Dr. Johnson would agree with me. The sperm is a living thing. The egg is living, and when they fertilize, they form a zygote. It's easy to, these days we will differentiate between legal identity at birth. A person has a legal identity at the time of birth. Before that is a non-personal. But many of you must have read in the news recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, where a child has sued the parent for legal damages and have obtained massive sums of money because perhaps the mother was drinking too much and it affected her brain or his brain, the brain of the child. Have you read things like that? Now, when this is happening, it then conveys an identity to the fetus or embryo. That's legalistic. I'm not going to get into that. My own view is that life begins already by the time of conception. I will have to see that as life. My colleagues might disagree with me, but I'll be happy to hear their views too.
I would say that that's probably the most common question that we get as teachers of embryology. I don't think I ever teach a class that after the lecture or during the lecture people will ask, when does it become a human being? That is a difficult question. There's one thing that's clear, is that human development, that is, the development of the embryo, starts when the sperm and the egg unite and form the zygote or the nutfa. That's when human development begins. It is a living cell. But when does it become a human being? It's difficult to say. We used to say that when its heart beats, well, that's about 21, 22 days. Others would say it's when it starts to look human, which is around 7 to 8 weeks. I think Muslims have a clear definition. In the one hadith that Dr. Persaud showed, it said that 42 days that the angel breathed on the embryo and gave it life. And in our discussions with the Muslim scholars, we've decided that it becomes a human being somewhere around 42 days. So I think that Muslims have something clear in their own holy book to explain that. Now, those who say it's a human being when it's one cell, I personally find that a little difficult to say one cell is a human being. It is the beginning of a human being. And when I talk in public to lay people and they ask me this question, I develop a slide and I take the acorn. You know, the oak tree drops an acorn. I hold up or show the picture of an acorn and say, is that an oak tree? Well, everybody says, no, it's crazy. It's not an oak tree. Well, then I said the zygote, or one cell, is not a human being. But if you put that acorn in the ground, suddenly it'll start to sprout a little plant, a little oak plant. And as soon as I see that little oak plant coming up from that acorn, then I say we've got a little oak tree. So the same in human embryology then, and I think this helps students think about it, that when it starts to look like a human being around the 6 weeks, 42 days, then we can call it a human being. And by the 8th week, it's distinctly human. It doesn't look like anything else. Up to that stage, 4, 5, 6 weeks, you can put a pig embryo, a rat embryo, a mouse embryo. You can't tell a human embryo from any of those others. But it becomes distinctively human in the 7th and the 8th week. Now, I don't know whether that's the answer. We don't know the answer. If we did, it would be easy. But when I talk to students, I give them this explanation. I say, now it's up to you to decide, talking with your religious leaders, for you to decide when human being begins. As I say, and I mention in my lectures, I say that the Muslim students are lucky because it tells them practically in their holy book when God breathed into this material and made it a human being.
I think it's not a scientific question. And as a scientist, there's no special wisdom on this platform to answer that question. It is a very significant legal question today, and it's a very emotive kind of connotations that go along with it. I think that's very unfortunate. We get into discussions, which I remember reading some old literature having to do with how many angels can stand on a pinhead. It sort of, to me, strikes me the same, because to say that it's a particular stage as a scientist is not really possible, because you can't say when it starts to develop as a nutfa or a zygote. You really can't, because there is development that goes on before that. The development of the new individual goes on in the testis of the father, because there are maturational programs that take place in the formation of the spermatozoan. And those are developmental kinds of events. They're essential to take place if this living thing, this spermatozoan, is going to go on and participate and continue. You can make the same statement even more strongly for the ovum, because we get a bigger piece of inheritance from our mothers than we do our fathers. All of our mitochondria, the parts of our cells that give us our energy, they all came from our mother. We don't get mitochondria from our father. And mitochondria have a good bit of DNA in them. So we get more genetic material, if you will, from our mothers than we do from our fathers. The programming of that DNA takes place in the mother's ovary. When does it take place? Probably when she herself is in her mother's uterus. So for the child, it would really begin then, if you look at it this developmentally way, it would begin back in the child's grandmother. So you can go on and on with this, and it's perfectly logical, scientifically defensible, and those are the real facts. So I think the question is one which society has chosen to raise. It's not really a scientific question, and I don't feel any particular special wisdom to answer it.
There's a question here which says, at what age is the embryo visible to the unaided eye? I think it's open to anyone. That's the easiest one.
I guess it depends how good your eyes are, but if you've got normal eyesight, you should be able to see it around 22, 23 days when it's is just about the size of a kernel of wheat. But without a magnifying glass or without some microscope, you wouldn't be able to see the details that we've shown you. So that, as Dr. Persaud said, when they were talking about the alica or leech-like substance, certainly they were not able to see that embryo, even if they opened up the uterus and look at it. It would be so small that I've seen them. They're just a little white spot. And it's only when you put a magnifying glass to it that you can actually see these details that make it look like a leech. So that they certainly didn't have that knowledge, and I would say you can't see it up until after 3 weeks.
Yes, a question like that, you have to be really careful on what is the definition of seeing. I can see a piece of dandruff on this tabletop. I can just barely make it out because this is a nice black surface. I can see no detail in it. If I want to see detail in it, then I need some sort of a visual aid, something to aid my vision. I need a magnifying glass. I need a microscope. And so I might be able to see the piece of dandruff, but to see any detail in it, as is described in the Qur'an, I needed an instrument which wasn't developed until the 1800s.
Following up on what Dr. Johnson has said, when the nutfa forms, what we call a zygote, that is about the size of a period at the end of a sentence. So you can see it, as Dr. Johnson says, but it's a period, but you wouldn't be able to see any detail. So it's just barely visible to the unaided eye at the beginning. But as I say, at 21 days, about the size of a kernel of wheat.
In your opinion, is there anything harmful if children who suckle from the same mother, marry each other? So open to anyone.
Well, you're talking about consanguinity, so there would be none necessarily. So if one is talking from the context of inheriting or magnifying or concentrating a genetic recessive adverse trait, something you don't want to have expressed, but when two people marry and they're closely related, you may concentrate that unfavorable characteristic, which otherwise would be recessive and not expressed. There's no genetic information that is in the milk. And if there were, it would be digested by the enzymes in the intestinal tract anyway.
But I know there is a surah or something, we've been asked that question before, where a mother takes in another child, an unrelated child, and feeds it.
Right.
Is there anything wrong with that? Well,
I think that's the question.
Yeah.
The intended question.
Yeah.
I don't know. They've had for centuries what they call wet nurses, and those children are not adversely affected by that. But there's an example of something that, when you ask, I don't know, and I don't know whether anyone else does. I don't know of anything that would be wrong with that. But maybe there's something that we will learn eventually that would be wrong, because we know that there are important constituents in human milk that are important for the child. And a number of years ago it was said that you wouldn't breastfeed, it's better to feed them with a formula and so on. Now people are going back to breastfeeding because they find that human milk has things in it that you can't get from a formula.
I just answered the question. Let's see. If the person is a carpenter, then they see all their problems as nails. Okay? So I just answered that question as a carpenter. I answered that question with my tools. My tools are those of the embryologist. That same question might be answered differently by someone who is a developmental psychologist. Because perhaps a discussion of to be nursed by, I translate that into a nail and have to do with the genetic outcome of the embryo. That's embryology. There might be other kinds of things which are not known, certainly not known to me, which may impact upon that and can be demonstrated experimentally. So my answer really wasn't, it was a nail. I'm a carpenter. Could be wrong.
There's a question here which says, where does the Bible stand in comparison? I guess it means the questioner here is referring to embryology, and if you know anything about verses in the Bible which are of a similar nature, if anybody has done any research in this area. I think Dr. Moore has been a bit active here.
Well, I haven't read the Bible as carefully as I've read the Qur'an. Because although as a young boy, I certainly was exposed to the Bible, because my father was a clergyman. And, when I started to study these verses from the Qur'an, I was asked that question, and I started to read more closely. I asked my friends who are clergymen, and they could not give me any verses in the Old or the New Testament that had any sense. Now, I have put in the historical section of my embryology books what it says in the Qur'an, and one of my Hindu friends said, "Oh, well, you should not be just putting in about Muslim. We got something in our books." And so they gave that to me, and I put that in fairness. But what it said in those Hindu books was about the idea that Dr. Persaud told about Aristotle and the mixing of the menstrual blood and the semen. That was an idea that could have been picked up from that older view. But it did go and say that we started and we developed day by day and so on. I forget the exact interpretation. But it had none of the accuracy that we find in the verses in the Qur'an.
There's a question here. It says that it could be said that in the past, civilizations were extremely scientifically advanced. Therefore, couldn't these verses in the Qur'an have been the result of many experiments performed by these civilizations?
No.
I think that Dr. Johnson has already given the answer, but that's true because this was our first response. The first response was there have been many, many great civilizations flourishing. Think of the Egyptian civilization. Think of the civilization that flourished in the Indus Valley, Harappa. Think of the Greek civilization, the Chinese. This was our first response, that knowledge had accumulated and somehow this knowledge had been consolidated and then regurgitated or reformulated. But this was our skepticism. We were skeptics as scientists. We did not want to accept that. But after we have looked into it, we saw that it was an empty and a barren pursuit. There was nothing there. So Dr. Johnson, I only elaborated. If you look at previous civilizations, like the previous question too, and all work of religion, you would find no description of human development as you find in the Quran, with such accuracy as regarding stages, and not only stages, but a careful description of those stages for that time that is so descriptive in itself.
Thank you. There's a question here which I don't understand. It says, ontogeny repeats phylogeny. Is it a valid theory? And if it is, does it not contradict the Islamic concept of the origin of man? Would you please comment? And here's the question.
Well, this question is presented to me, but I think I'll ask some of the others to answer too. But it's Haeckel's theory. Haeckel's theory as well. So it's true in some respect that within the embryo, within the uterus, it's some of the changes you see during embryonic development reflect some of the changes that have occurred during evolution of that species. During the evolution of that, whether it's a rat or a human being, over millennia, you are seeing a recapitulation of that within the womb. I don't personally see it as a contradiction of Islamic concepts of origins. But I will ask Dr. Moore and Dr. Johnson to comment, because it goes beyond the limits of my thinking.
I also agree. I don't see any contradiction there, but it's clear. In human embryology, for example, we develop two sets of kidneys before we get the set that we have now. We have what we call a pronephros kidney, doesn't function in the human embryo. Then we get a metanephros, or another type of kidney, which is the kidney the frog has. That kidney, we think, functions for a week or so, and then we get the metanephros, or the permanent kidney. So our as embryos that has the kidney of early stage. That's what that means. The time we develop repeat spiralizing. That is a fact. That's not exactly, I know what they mentioned in the front, but I don't see any problem with that. We've talked at length about evolution of the Islamic scholar, and this is a form of evolution, but it doesn't contradict anything we've seen in the Quran.
The question here says, do you know of any other, I think ayahs, the verses in the Quran or hadith, offhand, which contain scientific information which cannot still be fully grasped, other than the clay example, if anybody has anything in mind?
Yeah, well, I can't think of the actual passages, but the topics I can remember talking about. There are several in meteorology. There are several in geology. One I remember discussion of in botany. So there are a whole lot of them in diverse fields.
I think what the questioner was more concerned are the things there that we don't understand at this time. Is that what it was?
Yeah, I think maybe perhaps things which are ahead of us still, I think is...
Well, certainly when they asked us questions, they would come up and read a translation and say, what does that mean to you? And I'd think for a while and say, it doesn't mean anything to me. Better ask somebody else. So it's... As I said before, the fact that we don't understand it now just means that science hasn't developed to a state where we can explain it. Maybe in 100 years, if you ask that same verse, give it to someone, he'd say, oh, sure, that does that. Because if you had asked, if we were 150 years old and you had asked us this 80 years ago, we wouldn't have known the answers. So we have the advantage of the knowledge explosion that's occurred in the last 50 years, and it's going on very rapidly today. So I don't think anyone should be distressed if there are things in there that don't make sense. It's just that we don't have the knowledge.
There is one that has haunted us very much in the last few years, I can think of immediately. I have to have my script because that's the only way I remember the verses. There is one, it's Surah Al-Isra 17, Ayah 85. It says, they ask thee concerning the spirit of inspiration. Say, the spirit cometh by command of my Lord, and my Lord, it is only a little that is communicated to you. Then there is another one about the soul. Those are two surahs that are related somehow to the embryology. And we've always been asked about these surahs. Now, our answer to that has been, or my answer has been, I don't think the question of the soul is within the domain of science. It is not a scientific concept. Although I don't know if you have read recently in the Globe and Mail, somebody in Germany, they were weighing bodies before and after death, and they found that the dead bodies weighed a little less, and they said that was the soul that has gone. Anyhow.
I think we're running out of time. I just have two more questions. One is that, could some of the knowledge of the uterus, the embryo, and the teeth marks described have been known from autopsies done on I guess, bodies at that time? I think it's related a bit to previous questions.
I will answer like Dr. Johnson, no.
Because you couldn't see it. Those early stages, as I said, in those days, at 3 weeks, which is the stage of the mudga, you wouldn't be able to see that it looked like a leech at that stage. And so I just don't, even if you open it, and there's nothing to say, we know that they did autopsies, or at least not autopsies, but when they mummified, prepared the mummies, they took out the organs. So if they took out a uterus and they found a fetus in there, it's fine. But if they opened it up in those early stages, it's so small that you wouldn't be able to see it. So you wouldn't be able to see these stages. And when I was in Egypt and I was going through the tombs, I saw everything there. I saw some amazing things in the hieroglyphics. And some of the things that we think are new today that were there. But I looked and looked and never did see any pictures of the human embryo in those tombs. So I think if they had seen it, they would have had it there because they had everything else on those walls.
There's a question here which is very general. It says, are you aware of any other scientific discipline in which the Qur'an may contain statements which are being understood only today in the light of modern scientific knowledge? I think Dr. Johnson is a bit of an amateur geologist, and maybe he has some things to say in this regard.
Well, I'm out of my field, so I'm just speaking as a lay person. There is a statement in the Qur'an to the effect that mountains have roots. And from the viewpoint of the geologist, I have heard geologists discuss this topic, and they do have roots. That's as far as I could take it.
There's actually been a number of conferences on Quran and science in general. And recently there was one, I believe in Pakistan, and I think some of that information is being published and will probably be available soon. So we'll have to wait until then, I guess. I think we've reached the end of our time, so I apologize for not entertaining every question. I tried to be as fair as I could, and I tried to collect questions and put them forward. I'd like to especially thank the doctors here, Dr. Moore, Persaud, and Johnson, for taking the time off their busy schedules, and I know they're really busy, to come and share their findings with us.